Welcome to How to Handle the Toughest Job Interview Questions You'll Ever Get. My name is David Portney, and my career as a hiring manager spans 3 industries in 20 years. Starting in 2001, I began teaching workshops at school campuses and for job seekers at the California WorkSource Centers and the Workforce Investment Network. I've done workshops for job fairs over the years and also the Los Angeles Times Career Builders events, where I've spoken to groups of nearly 500 job seekers at a time. I've also been quoted in major newspaper articles like the Minneapolis-St. Paul Tribune and the Providence Journal, among many others. I'm the author of other audio programs for job seekers like Finding a Terrific Job in the Hidden Job Market, and my audio program titled The Secret of How to Ace Any Job Interview with Confidence. Now, in all my years of doing workshops for job seekers, one of the most common requests I get is how to handle questions, especially tough questions. In this program, we're going to focus on how to handle those tough job interview questions. So let's get right to it. Tell me about yourself. Why should I hire you? What are some of your strengths and weaknesses? What makes you think you're the right person for this position? Where do you see yourself in, say, 5 years? Have you ever been fired from a job? That's just a small sampling of the kinds of tough questions you might have to answer in a real job interview. As I said before, whenever I do a workshop for job seekers, every time one of the hot subjects of discussion is how to handle tough interview questions. Interview questions, and especially tough questions, are like being led into a minefield where one small step in the wrong direction can mean disaster. You need to know how to handle that before you go on a job interview. I'm not going to repeat information here that's already on one of my other audio programs, so if just thinking about having to answer questions, especially tough questions in a job interview, if that makes you nervous, then just be sure to listen to The Secret of How to Ace Any Job Interview with Confidence. That'll take care of any interview anxiety you might have. How you handle interview questions, and especially tough interview questions, can spell the difference between getting a job offer or not. That's why the focus of this program is helping you to know how to handle just about any question an employer can throw at you. Why do employers ask tough interview questions? There's actually a number of different reasons why. One may be to see how well you deal with pressure, or they might want to see how well you think on your feet, or maybe they want to find out how you handle something unexpected. But no matter what the reasons are, one thing is for sure. Questions, especially tough questions, are just part of the screening process. What do I mean when I say screening process? That means that they're asking you questions not only to find out if you fit the job in the company, but especially to discover if there's any reason why you should be eliminated as a candidate for the job. Always keep in mind that your number one task as a job seeker is to not get screened out, to not get eliminated, to not get kicked out of the game. It's vitally important that you keep that fact in mind. In order for you to be considered for the job, you must avoid being eliminated. When it comes to understanding how to handle tough interview questions, you need to realize that you're not going to memorize answers. If you come across like you're just rattling off memorized answers, that'll work against you. The purpose of this audio program is not to give you scripts to memorize like an actor playing a role. The purpose here is to get you prepared to handle any tough interview question with ease. We're going to cover here important do's and don'ts when it comes to handling tough questions. As we do that, I'll give you examples of good answers to tough questions, and you'll begin to understand the right ways and the wrong ways to answer questions. Obviously, there's no way to cover every possible question that employers could ask, because that's almost unlimited. Plus, the kinds of questions you may get could be specific to the particular job that you're interviewing for. But we're going to cover many of the kinds of tough questions that employers typically ask. Here's the goal that we're shooting for. The goal we're shooting for here is for you to be able to pretty much handle any random tough question that comes your way. The goal we want to reach is for you to know how to listen to the question behind the question, and also for you to understand the structure of how to answer tough questions in a way that allows you to put your best foot forward and make a positive impression with your answers. I always recommend that you prepare to handle a variety of questions that come up in an interview by writing down answers. By writing down your answers. It's important to write down your answers because that gets it out of your head and onto paper. Doing that forces your answer to make sense, because when you read what you wrote, it has to be coherent, concise, it has to be clear. Your answers need to make sense. Write them down and read them. If it doesn't make sense to you, it won't make sense to someone else. Make sure you make whatever changes you need to make so that your answers make sense in writing. Remember, that doesn't mean you're memorizing scripted answers. You're not memorizing scripted answers. You're just practicing so that when a potential employer starts throwing random questions at you, you'll be prepared for that. So I recommend that after you listen to this program, you write down your own answers to tough interview questions. Feel free to use any and all of the suggested answers I give you and all the ways of handling tough questions on this program, but actually just write down your answers. As I said before, keep in mind, you're not memorizing those answers. You're just writing them down, and that's going to help you handle tough questions much more easily when you're in a real job interview. It's also a good idea to have someone like a friend or family member pretend to be a hiring manager and have them ask you questions so you can practice answering the questions out loud too. If you want to get a list of tough interview questions to practice with, just go to my website at gethiredquick.com. Keep in mind that when the hiring manager asks you a question, be sure to always make your answer short and to the point, and be sure to answer the actual question they ask you. Let me repeat that because this is so important. When you're in a job interview and the hiring manager asks you a question, be sure to answer the question they actually ask and keep your answer brief and to the point. I can't tell you how many times I have asked a question in a job interview, and not only did they not answer the question I asked, but then they rambled on forever. Here's a couple more important tips about answering questions in a job interview. Sometimes people ask me if they should lie during a job interview, and the answer is definitely no. Don't tell lies in a job interview. It's expected that you will make the most of your experience, the most of your abilities, and make the most of your accomplishments, but you should never tell outright lies. Another point that's vitally important to remember: when you're handling questions in a job interview, always be positive, never say anything negative. I'll say more about that later. Also keep in mind the fact that there are different types of job interviews, so you can expect different types of tough questions. For example, there's the general screening type of interview. That's where they'll ask you a lot of general questions about your background, your work experience, your education, your accomplishments, and your ability to do the job. Then there's the stress interview, where they ask a lot of tough questions designed to confuse you, put you on the defensive, and make you sweat. Then, of course, there's the group interview, where there's more than one person asking you questions, or where you're part of a group and you have to answer questions in front of all the other people who are after the same job you are. By the way, if you find yourself in that last kind of interview, the kind where you're part of a group of job seekers, keep in mind that you're not only going to be evaluated by how you answer questions, but it's pretty likely you'll also be evaluated on your behavior while other people are answering questions. If you find yourself in a group interview like that, be sure to pay full attention to everything that's going on around you and not just when it's your turn to speak. In fact, no matter what kind of job interview you go on, be sure to act as if everything that happens while you're there is part of the job interview and that you're being evaluated at all times, even when you're just sitting in the waiting room before the interview even starts. So consider everything you do and say as being evaluated by someone there. Even the receptionist may be under instructions to report to the hiring manager about how you behave. All right, those are important points to keep in mind. Now let's find out how to handle the toughest job interview questions you'll ever get. Why did you leave your last job? Have you ever been fired from a job? Why were you fired from your last job? Have you ever been laid off before? If you've never had a job before in your life and you're applying for your very first job, then you probably don't have to worry about questions like that. But if you have had a previous job or previous jobs, employers and hiring managers may want to find out why you left those positions. Because if you were fired for cause like stealing or being late too many times, or some other misconduct on your part, that's going to be a big negative in the mind of the hiring manager who's conducting the job interview. Remember, the hiring manager's job is to find some reason not to hire you. Your job is to not provide that reason. So let's cover how to handle those tough questions about your past employment. Have you ever been fired? Why were you fired? If you have been fired, that's a pretty big negative to overcome. If you lie and say you haven't, but you actually have been fired, that could ruin your chances of getting the job, because if they call your former employer and they find out that you were fired and you said you weren't, they'll know you're a liar and you won't get hired. But if you were fired and you admit it, then you run the risk of them not hiring you, since they might just conclude that you deserve to be fired and that you're a bad employee. It sounds like a no-win situation, doesn't it? It's not. There is a way to handle this question properly. You have to be careful about what you say and how you say it, though. First of all, the wrong way to handle this question is by blaming your former employer. If you start blaming your past employer in a job interview, it's a fatal mistake. Don't make that fatal mistake. Why is that a mistake? Because if you're saying bad things about your former employer, then this prospective employer will fear a repeat of that situation. The best way to handle this explosive question is to focus your answer on you, not your former employer. Focus your answer on you and what you've learned since then. You need to come across as someone who made a mistake in the past but learned from that mistake. People can be surprisingly forgiving if you show remorse for your past mistakes, and that you've learned from your past mistakes, and that you've improved yourself as a result. Here's a couple of examples. Let's say you were fired from your last job for stealing. Your prospective employer asks if you've ever been fired before, and you say yes. And they ask you why. You could say something like this. I was fired for stealing office supplies. I stole a stapler and some pens. I knew it was wrong to steal. I was raised to be honest. I made the mistake of following along with the other employees who all said it was okay to take a few small things home. I've learned that it's important for me to stick to my moral standards and not just follow along with the crowd. I believe that I learned a valuable lesson about staying true to my moral standards and not become influenced by what everyone else is doing. Now you see what we did there. You learned from your mistake, you regret it, and you talked about how that made you a better person now and in the future. Now let's say, for example, you were fired for being late. You could say something like this. I was fired for being late too many times. I was younger then, and I didn't truly understand the importance of being punctual for work. Since then, I've matured some, and I realized that punctuality is vital to the smooth operation of a business. I've learned to take my job more seriously and put more pride into what I do, and that includes being on time. If you were to say something like that in a sincere manner, you have a very good chance of being forgiven for your past mistakes. The key is you need to show remorse for your past mistake. I suggest that you actually do feel remorse for your past mistakes and not just fake remorse. You need to show and explain how not only you feel remorse, but it's made you a better person as a result. And you need to explain how that experience has not only made you a better person now, but how that will apply in the future. Tell me about yourself. Tell me about yourself. That is a tough interview question. Although a lot of people don't always see that as a tough question. In fact, a lot of job seekers see that as an easy question because they see that as an opportunity to just talk about themselves. But I want to suggest that instead of you viewing that question as an opportunity for you to tell that person all about your likes and dislikes in life, I suggest you keep things on a professional level. How do you do that? Here's how. So you're sitting there, and maybe you just sat down, you shook hands, just met, and now you're sitting down. And the hiring manager has your resume in front of them. They look up at you and they say, so tell me about yourself. Again, I think it's a mistake to view that question as an opportunity to just ramble on about all the things you like to do in your spare time. I think that you ought to take that question and use that opportunity to talk about your professionalism, your efficiency, how you're a punctual kind of person, that you're the kind of person who likes to see a job through to completion. You like to make sure projects get done. You're the kind of person who has the ability to multitask and handle more than one thing at a time. You see what we're doing there? Rather than just talking about how you like to go to Disneyland or your favorite color is purple, instead, when they say, tell me about yourself, you're talking about qualities that you have that you can apply to the job you'll do. So think ahead and write down things that are true about you, that would apply to a business situation. General things, like being able to handle pressure, or are you a good leader if you're applying for a management position? Or are you a good follower? Do you take orders well if you won't be in a management position? I think you see what I mean. So be sure to write down 4 or 5 different things that are true about you that you can say quickly and easily without sounding like you're rehearsed or like you're just, reading off a script, right? Write down 4 or 5 things about yourself that are true that apply in a professional situation. Things about your efficiency, your ability. Make sure you write down qualities that you have that could apply in a professional situation. Tell me about the worst boss you ever had. That is a tough interview question, and most job seekers make a fatal mistake when they answer that question. Most job seekers think that that question is an opportunity for them to just go on and on about some horrific experience that they had in the past with some boss. But I've got to tell you, that's not the case. This is a time when you want to steer clear of any negativity at all. Now, you may have had a horrible boss. You may have had horrible bosses. You may have real horror stories about people who treated you poorly, bosses who were completely unreasonable. This is not the opportunity to talk about that. It's for sure true that this is your opportunity to turn that into a positive. And I'll explain how to do that. But first of all, be 100% clear that you should never, ever bring up negatives in a job interview, and especially with a question like this. Don't make the mistake of thinking that this is your opportunity to get it off your chest. It's not. But that's what most job seekers do. In fact, I've asked this question of job seekers a lot of times. And I can't think of one time where someone really turned it into a positive. In fact, every time a job seeker answered that question in a job interview that I conducted, they used it as an opportunity to get it off their chest. It was almost like they felt like they were in a psychologist's office, and now was their opportunity to talk about that horrible boss they once had. Well, I have to tell you, human nature being what it is, if you tell some horror story about a past boss you had, the person who is sitting there listening to your story is going to assume that you're going to feel the same way about them. Now, once again, I don't recommend lying in a job interview, but what I do recommend is that you put the best positive spin on any answer you give. So maybe you've had a boss in the past that really didn't particularly give you a lot of work to do. Maybe you had a particularly easy job, if that's possible. And if it is, your answer could be this instead. It could be, you could stop and think. You could stop and pause and think. And then, after you pause, you could say something like, well, I did have this one boss who, well, he wasn't really a bad boss. It's just that the position really, he didn't put a lot of demands on me in that position. And so the position wasn't as challenging as it could have been, and I didn't have the opportunity to grow as much as I could have, simply because the boss didn't make many demands on me. Now you see that that puts a positive spin on the answer of having a bad boss. And it puts the focus on you, not the other person. It puts the focus on the opportunities you want to grow and to learn professionally. You see how that works? So stop and write down an answer for how would you handle a question like that. Tell me about the worst supervisor or the worst boss you ever had. In the workshops that I do, one of the questions that job seekers very often will ask me about is how to handle a question when their resume shows that they haven't worked for very long at any one job. In other words, they may show on their resume that they've worked 5 jobs in the past, but have only been there maybe 6 or 8 months or only a year at each job. And it kind of looks like they just hop from job to job without spending any real time there. Job seekers get concerned about that and want to know how to handle that in a job interview. And the reason why should be obvious, because the hiring manager is going to look at that and they're going to think to themselves, oh great, I hire this person and they're going to be here 6 months or 8 months or maybe a year, and then they're going to take off. Because that's the pattern on the resume, right? Right. So how do you handle that? Do you just say, I'm not very good at staying at a job? No, I'm going to suggest not. I think that one of the ways to handle that is to frame that in the most positive way possible. You see, in your past, you worked at those jobs and you didn't stay very long because, you know, you were kind of finding yourself and finding what was good for you. And when you took the job at the time, you thought it was a good idea. You thought it was a good job for you. You thought it was a good fit with that company. But you learned that it really wasn't the right job for you at that time. Now, that's going to be especially true if you have had a lot of different kind of jobs, because an employer or prospective employer might look at your resume and say, you know, gosh, I see that you've got experience at these 5 different companies previously, and they're all different jobs. I mean, how do you explain that? Well, again, you want to explain that by saying that you just hadn't found yourself yet, that you applied for those positions at the time thinking that they were the right job for you and that you'd be a good fit at that company and in that position. And that the reason why you left that job is to move on to another opportunity, and then unfortunately you found out that that position really wasn't right for you either. And that now, after having done that several times, you know what's right for you, and that's why you're applying for this job at this company. You see, the question behind the question, when they ask you about why have you spent short periods of time at your previous jobs, the question behind that question is, how much time can I expect out of you here? Now, they may actually ask that straight away. They may actually say, if I were to hire you, how long would I get you for? You planning on going back to school? You planning on relocating? And I think it's a fair question. So what I'd like you to do right now is write down an answer. How would you handle that question? Now, maybe you have lots of experience in previous jobs and you didn't jump around a lot and you stayed in all the same positions, so you think that maybe this question doesn't apply to you. But still, even if it doesn't, write down the answer to the question, how long would I get you for if I hired you? It's perfectly reasonable for an employer to want to know how long they can have you for. Because if they go through all the time and energy of hiring you, and then you're gone in 6 months or a year, and they were hoping to have you longer, then it's painful for them because they have to go through all the time and expense of finding someone new to hire to replace you. So if you're planning on going back to school in a year, maybe it's best if you tell them the truth. If you expect maybe you can give them 3 to 5 years, then why not tell them that? Or, if you really are looking for a home, some place to work for the rest of your life until you retire, you could tell them that too. Why should I hire you for this job? Now that's a tough question, but it's pretty easily handled. This is where you want to take your skills, your abilities, as well as your positive qualities, and apply them to the specific position that you're applying for and that you're interviewing for. Now, of course, I probably don't know you personally, and I probably also don't know exactly what kind of job you're trying to get. So you'll need to figure this out for yourself, but you want to take your positive qualities and apply them to this position. You want to take your specific skills and apply them to this position. And you want to take your specific abilities and apply them to this position. Again, I don't know what your positive qualities are and what your skills are, but you do. You know exactly what they are, or you should. And if you're not clear on them, get clear on them. Write them down. Write down what skills and abilities and qualities you have that would apply to this position. Go ahead and do that now. Before we go on to our next tough job interview question, I've got another good piece of advice for you, and it's this. Sometimes, when you get asked a question, pause before you answer. Pause before you answer. Now, it doesn't mean you have to pause on every question, but here's the thing. If you sit there in a job interview and you answer a series of questions and you just instantly blurt out answers every time someone asks you a question, it might appear that you're rehearsed. It might appear that you're rehearsed. Now, you may have rehearsed, and using this program, you are going to rehearse. But the idea of that rehearsal is not to appear scripted. It's not to memorize answers and then just blurt them out when you get asked that question. The idea is so that you just won't be surprised, you won't be shocked when you get asked a question. The idea is that you'll be prepared. So every once in a while when you get asked a question, pause. Just stop and pause, even if you know what the answer is, and then deliver your answer. Here's another tough job interview question that you may have to handle. And it has to do with you not being as qualified as other people that the hiring manager has already interviewed. So it could go something like this. You're sitting there and the hiring manager is looking at your resume, and then they look up at you and they say, you know, I've interviewed some other people who have more experience or more education than you do. Tell me why I should hire you and not them. That seems like a tough question, doesn't it? Here's what you want to do. You want to explain that people who are more experienced are probably also more set in their ways. They're probably less flexible. They're probably going to be less willing to learn how things are done at this company. However, you, on the other hand, you're flexible. Your inexperience, as it were, which the hiring manager was making sound like a weakness, is actually a strength. How is it a strength? It's a strength because you're not set in your ways. You're not some prima donna who's going to come in and say, well, that's not the way we did it at the company I used to work for. No, you're going to come in and you're going to be flexible. You're going to be willing to learn and adapt to exactly the way they want things done there. So you want to turn that negative into a positive. A couple of very common interview questions that come up are about your strengths and weaknesses. So let's start with your strengths. When it comes to them asking about your strengths, probably your best bet is going to be to apply them to the specific job that you're applying for at this company. So, in other words, rather than just kind of rambling on about general strengths that you have, that you're generally a punctual person and you like to see a task through to completion and you're a good team player, apply it specifically to that company. Say, well, I'm the kind of person, here's some of my strengths. I'm the kind of person who's going to come to this job on time every day. I'm the kind of person who's going to be able to work with the existing team here, and I'm a good team player that way. I'll work with the people who are here. And you want to apply all of your strengths specifically to that position. Does that make sense? So, in other words, rather than just talking about your strengths in general, take 2 or 3 or 4 of your specific strengths that you already know that you have and apply them specifically to the position you're applying for. Now let's talk about how to handle questions about your weaknesses. Generally speaking, there's 2 different strategies when it comes to answering questions about your weaknesses. And the first strategy is to turn your weakness into a strength. So the hiring manager asks you a question like, so tell me about some of your weaknesses. Here's what you do. You say, well, one of my weaknesses is that I just hate incomplete projects. I mean, I have this drive to completion. If I'm assigned a project to bring to completion, I don't know, it's just kind of a weakness I have. I just can't really rest until I finish that project. Or here's another example of turning a so-called weakness into a strength. Let's say that you say something like this. Well, another weakness that I have is that frankly, I have to be on time. It just bugs me if I'm late. It's just a weakness that I have. I really am intolerant of myself if I'm late, so I just absolutely have to be on time. And that's an example of taking a weakness and turning it into a strength. The second strategy for handling questions about your weaknesses is actually just telling them about a true weakness that you have. You see, the first strategy I told you about where you turn a weakness into a strength, you know, a lot of employers and hiring managers, they can see through that strategy. They may even say, okay, that's great. Now tell me about a real weakness that you have. So strategy number 1, where you're turning a so-called weakness into a strength, you can either use that or you can use strategy number 2. And maybe strategy number 2 is stronger, and here it is. Tell them about a real weakness that you have, but make it something that has nothing to do with the position that you'll be in at that company. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you're applying for, let's just say a management position. And let's say that in that management position, you're not going to be doing any data entry, that they have people who do data entry. Then you could tell the hiring manager when they ask about tell me about a weakness that you have. And you can say, one of my weaknesses, honestly, is data entry. I mean, I can do it, and I can even do it accurately, but I just don't particularly like it, and I just don't think I'm all that good at it. Again, I can do it, but it's just probably a weak area that I have is data entry. And then immediately turn around to a positive. However, that's offset by my positive of being a good team leader or some other positive quality that you have. So after you tell them about this weakness that you have, like in my example, you're weak at data entry, immediately turn around and tell them about a positive that you have. However, that's offset by the fact that, and then you tell them about a positive. Tell me about the best job experience you've ever had. Hey, wait a second, that doesn't sound like a tough interview question, does it? You know what? Sometimes questions that sound easy are actually tough questions in disguise. You see, many job seekers, when they get asked a question like that, they think it means that they should just ramble on about some really lax job, some really easy job that they had, some job where there was no supervision and they could just come in any time they wanted to and they didn't have to work hard. Believe it or not, that's the kind of answers I've seen when I've asked that question. So what you want to do is you actually want to take advantage of that question by giving an answer that has to do with challenge, learning, growth, and professional development. That's right. You want to answer the question saying that the best job experience you ever had was the one that offered you the best opportunities for challenge, for growth, and for professional development. And so that's how you should answer that question. You should say something like, the best job experience I ever had was this one business where, and then you talk a little bit about the professional development opportunities you had, or the challenges that you enjoyed because it helped you to grow and develop. So that's the way you want to handle a question like that. On the other hand, you may get a question like, tell me about the worst job experience you ever had. Now, this is very similar to the previous question where we talked about how to handle a question like, tell me about the worst supervisor or the worst boss you ever had. Just like that question, this is not an opportunity for you to talk about some terrible job that you had in the past. And I'm going to suggest that the way to handle this question is very similar to the way you handled the question about your best work experience. Your worst work experience in the past is the one that did not give you an opportunity to learn. It did not give you an opportunity to grow. It did not give you a chance for professional development. It was a job where you weren't able to be in a position of learning, growing, developing, being challenged professionally. So the worst position you've ever had is one where you didn't have an opportunity to grow and develop. And when you stop and think about it, I hate to say this, but a lot of people get into jobs and they want to do the least they possibly can. I really hate to say that because a lot of people get into jobs they don't want to be in. A lot of people just are working because they need a paycheck, and that's kind of sad. In fact, you should get into a job you want to be in that you would look forward to. And my program, How to Get a Terrific Job in the Hidden Job Market, if you don't already have that program, you should check it out, because in that program we talk about how to go into a different mental frame of mind where instead of just taking whatever job you can get out there, you shift your mental perspective and you shift into a totally different frame of mind, which is what would be a great job that you could get or maybe even enjoy. And I talk about all the strategies about how to do that. But my point here in handling this question is simply that the answer to this question is that your worst job experience is one where you didn't have the opportunity for professional development, or there was no challenge or no opportunity to learn and grow. And I want to suggest that you take that seriously, that when you go into job positions, you should look for every opportunity to develop and grow. Seriously. I highly encourage you, don't just get a job and slide by doing the least you can do. Seriously. If there's any opportunities to grow and learn and develop and have challenge, I recommend you take all of them. A lot of employees will complain about being forced to take trainings on communication skills or management skills or other areas of professional development. You know what? If your employer is going to pay for that, which they usually do, then I say go for it. I say take every opportunity for professional development you possibly can, because you never know where that's going to pay off great for you in the future. So definitely the worst job you've ever had, that's the one that didn't give you any opportunity for professional development. Now, before we go on to our next tough interview question, let's talk about psychological profiling. Let's talk about where you may have to sit down and complete a survey or form or questionnaire of some sort that may be some kind of psychological profile. What many job seekers do is they answer the questions the way they think the employer wants them to answer the question. And you could do that if you wanted to, but I think that's probably going to be a mistake. In fact, I've known job seekers who've done this, where they filled out the form the way they thought the employer wanted them to. They answered the questions the way they thought the employer would like best. They didn't get the job. See, here's the thing. If you do have to fill out that type of questionnaire, and it may be a psychological profile, you might as well give them an accurate profile. The reason is that different positions are going to be better for different kinds of people. For example, somebody who has the personality of a salesperson is going to be miserable in the accounting department. And the reverse is true too. Somebody who has the personality of an accountant would be miserable as a salesperson. So if you give somebody a psychological profile questionnaire and they answer all the questions differently than they really are, then you can see where that's going to create a problem. So again, if you have somebody on your hands, if you're looking to hire somebody and you're looking to hire a salesperson, you want to know if that person really has the qualities of a salesperson. Salespeople need to have really extroverted personalities and a lot of charm and a lot of charisma. That's a great set of qualities to have in salespeople. On the other hand, those same great qualities might not be so great in an accountant. If you need somebody to be sitting at a computer crunching numbers and all they want to do is float around and socialize, that's the wrong person to put in the accounting department. So if you do have to take some kind of questionnaire, you know what? Answer the questions the way you really are. Don't answer the questions the way you think the employer wants you to answer them. If you were an animal, what kind of animal would you be? You know, strange questions like that can really leave you scratching your head, wondering why they're asking questions like that, first of all, and second of all, what's the best way to handle a question like that? Well, as far as why they ask questions like that, there could be a number of reasons, including just wanting to see how you think on your feet or handle the unexpected. In terms of how to handle a question like that, so let's say that you're sitting there across from a hiring manager and they look at you and they say, so if you were an animal, what kind of animal would you be? Here's what I'd like to suggest. I suggest that you say something like this. Well, if I were an animal, I guess I'd probably be a beaver, because beavers are hardworking, they work well in teams, and they seem to get the job done. Now you see what we did there is we didn't do what most people would do. Most people would say, well, I'd want to be a bird so I could fly high in the sky and be free. No, 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 no. Don't answer questions like that. Keep it professional. So the kind of animal you would be would have the kind of qualities that would be great qualities for you to have at that job. You get it? Qualities like hardworking, efficient, task-oriented, working well with others. Does that make sense? I'm sure you see what I mean. So if you get bizarre questions like that, like what kind of animal would you be, keep it professional. Make your answer be something that applies to the task and the job at hand. Now, another thing that you might want to do is incorporate the pause, because if someone asks you what kind of animal you would be, and you've already rehearsed your answer and you just blurt it out, maybe it's going to be better if you stop and pause and think about their question, or at least appear to be thinking about the question, and then you can answer it. So that's how to handle bizarre questions like that. Keep it professional. Keep it to the tasks that you would be performing at that job function. Make your answer related to the professional environment you'll be working in and the job that you'd be doing. If you do that, then you can be assured that you're answering the question in the best possible way. As I've said before, I don't advocate telling lies when you're asked questions in job interviews. I suggest that you tell the truth. Now, the reality is that sometimes you can get asked a question that you really don't want to tell the truth about, or that you're just not sure how to make it be positive somehow. And one of the questions that comes up from time to time in workshops that I teach is where somebody has been out of work for a while. Maybe they took time off to raise a child or to take care of an ailing family member. And so that took them out of the job market for a while, and now they're back looking for a job. And it could be years later. It could be 5 years, 8 years, 10 years. It could be a long time. So it's a fair question for a hiring manager or employer to say, gee, you've been out of the workforce for so long. How come? Now, really, it may be none of their business that you were raising children or taking care of an ailing parent or family member. But if it is something like that, I suggest that you just tell them that. Just tell them that you took time off to raise your child because you felt that it would be better if you raised your child rather than a nanny. Or if you took care of an ailing family member, I would suggest that you just are honest and tell them that. Those are positive things, and you can't go wrong by telling somebody that you took time out to do something good for somebody. On the other hand, what if you've been out of the workforce for a long time because of reasons that are not really as good as those? Like, let's say you either just took some time off to travel the world or goof off. How do you handle that? So, in those cases, you may have to just reply in a vague kind of way, an unspecific kind of way as much as possible. You could say it was for personal reasons that you'd really rather not go into. Now, again, you don't know how people are going to respond to that. Some people might think, ooh, personal reasons he doesn't want to talk about, must be something bad. On the other hand, they may just respect your privacy. They may feel that, okay, this is something that they just don't want to talk about. It was some personal reason, and it's none of my business. Now, as always, I'm going to suggest that if you were out of the job force for a long time, and you're challenged on that, you're asked about that, try and turn that into a positive somehow. After you answer the question, well, I was out because I was taking care of a parent, or I was out because I was raising children, or I was out because of personal reasons I'd rather not go into, then immediately follow it up with some kind of positive, but I've been taking classes, or I've been doing research, or you've been doing something actively recently, let's say, to make sure that your skills are at a positive level. Or your positive doesn't have to be something that you've been doing, but something that you want to do. You could say, yes, I have been out for a while, but I'm very eager to learn, and I'm very eager to get back up to speed. And I feel that my past experience will allow me to get back up to speed quickly, despite the time that I was out of the job force. So if you do get a question like that, and you have been out of work for a while, that's going to be your best bet on how to handle it. Interview questions that can be particularly tough are illegal questions, unlawful inquiries. You see, here in the United States, there's actually federal guidelines that have to do with what questions you're allowed to be asked in a job interview. But what if a hiring manager actually asks you an illegal question? How do you handle that? What if they ask you illegal questions about, like, for instance, your marital status? Employers are not really allowed to say, hey, are you married? Or do you plan to be married? They're not allowed to ask women if they plan to be pregnant. When it comes to your physical health, they're not allowed to ask questions about that. In other words, hey, do you have any handicaps? Now, there are ways for employers to kind of change their questions so that they are lawful inquiries instead of unlawful inquiries. So, for instance, an employer can say, can you lift 40 pounds? And not, do you have a handicap? They can also ask, when it comes to your physical health, do you need any special accommodations to perform the job you've applied for? They can ask that too. But what if you do get an absolutely illegal question? Do you have the capacity to reproduce? Are you planning on having children? Are you married, or do you plan to get married? Those are illegal questions. What if someone asks that? What should you do? Well, here's the thing. You can either just answer the question that they're asking, or you could decline to answer. That's true. You could just answer the question. Now, if you answer the question and you know it's an illegal question, there's a couple of thoughts here. One is they may not realize that that's an illegal question. Or they may. And you may or may not want to really work for a company that's going to be doing things like that. That's something to consider. Remember that the interview process is not just them interviewing you, but you interviewing them as well. In fact, I talk about that more on my other audio program, The Secret of How to Ace Any Job Interview with Confidence. And I cover a lot of questions that you could and should ask potential employers. Because they may be screening you, but you're screening them too. So if someone asks you illegal questions, maybe you might not want to work for a company like that. Because if they're going to be okay with asking you illegal questions, they may also be okay with requiring you to do all kinds of crazy things on your job you shouldn't be doing, like maybe even illegal things. So you could either just answer the question, or you could decline to answer the question. And in fact, if you do decline, I want to suggest that you don't say, hey, that's an illegal question. If you're still interested in making a positive impression with them, I suggest that you don't say, hey, that's an illegal question, I'm not going to answer it. However, you could decline to answer a question, and you could very politely say, well, I'd like to politely decline from answering that question. So you can do that. So when it comes to illegal questions and unlawful inquiries, you're going to have to decide for yourself how best you want to handle that. Do you want to just answer the question or politely decline? From time to time when I'm teaching a workshop for job seekers, someone will raise their hand and say, hey, what should I do when I'm in a job interview and the hiring manager asks me if I'd be willing to lie for the company? Boy, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Imagine that you're sitting there in a job interview and the hiring manager looks you right in the eye and says, would you be willing to lie for the company? Think about that. First of all, if you answer yes, maybe that would count against you because maybe they're not interested in hiring somebody who's a liar. Maybe they only want to hire honest people. On the other hand, if you say no and they want somebody who's willing to bend the truth for them, then you wouldn't get that job. Now, here's my suggestion. My suggestion is tell them the truth about what you would or wouldn't do. So if you're the kind of person who won't lie, doesn't want to lie, believes that telling the truth is important, then tell them, no, I won't lie for the company. Is it possible that that would possibly cost you that job opportunity? Yes. but you'll sleep better at night and you'll feel better in the long run without being torn up inside with the dilemma of your boss asking you to lie and you don't want to. On the other hand, if they ask you if you're willing to lie for the company and you say yes, and that's what they do want, then there's a good match, right? So if you're willing to lie, then you could tell them that you're willing to lie. So I'm not going to preach to you, and I'm not going to tell you what your moral standards should be. If you're the kind of person who's willing to lie or not willing to lie, I don't point any fingers and I hold no judgments. But in either case, I would say answer truthfully about what you are willing or not willing to do. Let's take a couple of minutes right now just to talk about some general guidelines of how to handle tough interview questions. First of all, keep your answers brief. If the hiring manager wants to know more, they'll ask you to expand on your answer. Number two, always be positive with your answer. Never be negative. Seriously. Even if you're invited to make negative statements, like in some of the questions we've already talked about, like tell me about your worst boss or tell me about the worst job you ever had, that is not license to be negative. That is not your opportunity to really tell them about some horrible boss you had. Always stay positive. Number three, keep your answers focused on what you can do for the company. You know, it's been said that most people just listen to one radio station, WIIFM, what's in it for me? And your potential employer wants to know what's in it for them if they hire you. So when you're handling questions in a job interview, tough questions, any questions, make sure that you, number one, keep it brief, number two, always stay positive, and number three, keep it focused on what you can do for the employer. Keep it focused on how your skills, your abilities, your experience, your education is going to make their life better, easier, more profitable, with less expenses. Always keep focused on what you can do for them. Imagine that you're sitting in a job interview and the hiring manager looks at you and says, "So, how come you haven't found a job yet?" Maybe in previous conversation during the course of the interview, you've revealed that you've been looking for a job for 2 months or 5 months or whatever. And so at some point he says to you, "So how come you haven't found a job yet?" And the implication in that question is that there's something wrong with you, right? The implication in that question is that unless something's wrong with you, you would have already found a job. So it's almost like the question is, what's wrong with you? So I suggest the way to handle a question like that, well, how come you haven't found a position before now, is because you're selective. You're picky. You want to make sure that you find the right fit. You just haven't found the right position yet, and that you don't want to waste an employer's time and your time by just taking some job prematurely. You're taking the time to make sure that it's a good fit between you and the company that you get hired at. From time to time, you may get an interview question like this. What would your previous boss say about you? Or, what do you think your previous coworkers would say about you? And once again, what I want to suggest is that, well, first of all, you keep your answer somewhat brief. Don't ramble on forever about how they would say how great you are. Number two, definitely keep it positive. Mention that they would talk about some positive attributes you have. Mention 1, 2, 3 quick things that they would say positive about you, and then apply it to the position that you're applying for in that company. So, for example, if the person says, "So tell me, what do you think your previous boss would say about you?" Then you could say something like, and let's say that you know at this new job that you're going to be part of a team and that you're going to be expected to help bring projects to completion. Then you could say, well, my previous boss would say that I was a team player and that I was really good at helping to bring projects to completion. And that's why I think it would be a good fit at this company, because at this company I expect to really fit in with the team and assist the team in the overall goals to help bring projects to completion. So remember, just keep your answer brief, mention some positives, and then link it to how you'll bring value to that company. One of the best things you can always do in answering questions is point out how you'll bring value to that company. Here's a few miscellaneous questions you might get. What motivates you to do a good job? Now, a good answer to this interview question might be something like, what motivates me to do a good job is having responsibilities and being acknowledged for when a job is done well. Another question you might expect to hear is, why do you want to work here? In that case, you might want to talk about some of the interesting details of the job and why they fascinate you. Make sure you've done your research on the company. If you need to know how to do research on a company, be sure to check out my other audio product called The Hidden Job Market. Now, when they do ask you, why do you want to work here? Don't talk about what you want. Talk about their needs. Talk about how you want to help them achieve their goals or be part of a specific company project. Tell them how you want to solve their problems. Talk about how you want to make a definite contribution to their goals. Why do you want this job? Now, you're going to have a clear answer in mind. Now, even if privately you're not really sure what the answer to that is, you're going to have to decide why you would want that job. What do you know about our company? Again, do research ahead of time, either on the internet looking at their website or by calling their sales department ahead of time if they have one and asking questions of the sales department. Maybe you can find resources in the library to help you do research on that company. Find out as much as you can about the company, including their products, the size of the company, what kind of income they generate, what their reputation is and their image. Find out everything you can about the company ahead of time. If you currently have a job and you're looking for a new one, you could be in a position where you're in an interview and they know that. So there's some questions that could come up in a context like that. And they might say something like this. They might ask, well, why are you leaving your present position? In a case like that, you'd probably want to stay as positive as possible. You wouldn't want to complain about your job. You might say that it's just not challenging anymore and you need new challenges. Certainly it could be possible that the business that you're working for is experiencing problems and maybe their sales are slowing down. It's going to be up to you whether you want to share something like that or not, though. However, explaining that your job is no longer challenging and you feel your talents are best used elsewhere is a pretty safe answer. Another question that you might get if someone knows that you're currently working somewhere but looking for a new job, they may ask you what you think of your current boss. Now, once again, be as positive as you can, even if you don't really believe it. Always think how you can answer a question as positively as possible. So always stay positive, and even if your current boss does have a number of negative traits, just think about what positive traits that he or she has and describe those. Now, another question that could come up in this context where you have a job currently but are looking for another one is they could ask you this. What other types of jobs or companies are you considering? In that case, I'd recommend to keep your answer related just to that industry, just to that field, and not talk about specific company names. In every workshop that I teach for job seekers, without fail, someone raises their hand and says, how do I handle it when the employer asks me how much I want to be paid? What if they say something like, how much do you expect to make if we offer this position to you? What do you say if they ask you, what kind of salary are you worth? How do you handle it when they say, how much are you looking for? You may have heard the old expression that the person who names price first loses. And clearly it's a little bit of a sticky situation, because if your answer is too high, then you may have priced yourself out of a job. And if your answer is too low, then your prospective employer may feel like they can get you at a really low price. So a safe answer is to answer with a question. For example, what's the salary range for similar jobs in your company? Or perhaps you could ask, gosh, what did the person who had this job previously make? Now, if they dodge your question, then perhaps a safe answer would be to answer with a range of what you understand you're worth in the marketplace. Now, you can get those kinds of things on the internet, like monster.com, and other places on the internet have free services that allow you to plug in your job title and figure out what the average is for your industry, or certainly what the range is. Now, if you're really pressed to make an answer, you could say something like this. My understanding is that a job like the one you're describing may be in the range of, and then state the range. A typical tough job interview question is how well you can handle pressure and deadlines. Well, how well do you handle pressure and deadlines? Probably, if you're not very good at handling pressure, you don't want to say that you're great at handling it, because, you know what, the truth is going to come out later anyway. And a safe answer, of course a true answer, is the fact that, you know what, pressure and deadlines, that's just the way life is, and that's the way business is. So rather than just say that yes, you can handle pressure and yes, you can work to deadlines and leave your answer at just yes, after you say yes, I can work well under pressure and I can handle deadlines, then turn around and cite one or two examples of your success. Right after that, so they say, how well can you handle pressure, or can you work well to deadlines? And you say, yes, I can. And as a matter of fact, and then you go on to tell a brief story or two about how you handled pressure and deadlines in the past. You may be asked questions about your ability to handle difficulties when they arise at work, or what kind of problem solver you are, or how you handle conflict. Certainly a safe answer could be something like this. Well, it depends on the situation. You know, of course, every situation is different, and the nature of the exact problem. But generally speaking, I'm a patient person and good at working out compromises and solutions. If you can actually cite examples from the past, that's helpful. So you tell them, yes, you're good at handling problems, you're good at handling difficulties, you're good at handling conflict, and here's an example of exactly how you handled conflict or difficulty in the past. How do you feel about working late or overtime? But that's a tough question, because you may not want to work late or work overtime. On the other hand, you may be okay with working late. Overtime oftentimes means extra pay, so you may like that as well. Naturally, I don't know whether you like overtime or working late or not. You could always ask how often working late or working overtime comes up. You could say something like, I understand that sometimes it's necessary to get the job done, so I'll do whatever it takes to achieve our goals. Now, on the other hand, you may not be able to say something like that if you have obligations like children to pick up or other obligations that demand that you leave a job at a certain time. So naturally, it's really going to be up to you to decide whether you can or want to work late or overtime. Depending on what kind of job you're applying for, you might get a question about your ability to save a company money. They may say, tell me about a time when you saved money for an employer. Now, what they're looking to find out is some specifics of how you did that. You see, companies are always interested in saving money. They always want to reduce expenses. So there's two things involved with answering this question. One is giving them the actual step-by-step approach you took to save a company money. Now, keep that brief. Don't go on for 5 minutes about how you came up with the approach and implemented it and how many employees were involved and all that stuff. Just give them the quick step-by-step, this is what I did, and then tell them how much money you saved, either in dollars or in percentages. Make it a quick, brief example. Again, make sure you tell them the exact process you used to save money and how much money you saved, either in actual dollars or percentages or both. How well do you manage your time? How do you manage your work week? How do you make realistic deadlines? Potential employers may ask you questions about how you manage your time. What they really want to know is, are you well organized? What they want to know is, can you manage your time well? Do you use some kind of time management system already? Tell them about it then. Tell them about how you plan ahead. They want to know if you're able to set reasonable expectations and goals for yourself and how you achieve those goals in a reasonable amount of time. Always use examples from your current or past jobs. Describe how you allocated time. Let's say you were in sales. You could tell them that on Monday you reserved that day for cold calls. Then on Tuesday through Thursday you made your sales calls. And then on Friday you handled paperwork. Tell them that you reserve an hour a day for planning if you do. Maybe there's a certain time of day, either the beginning of the day or the end of each day, when you sit down and you plan. Be specific about what you do with respect to time management. Don't just say, yeah, I manage my time well. But what if you're new to the job market? Maybe you're a student who's getting a first-time job, or maybe a housewife entering the job market for the first time. What do you do then? Then simply mention specific examples from your past of how you did plan your time, and especially how that led to an efficient use of your time and your success as a result of that time management skill. So as a student, you could say how you had to balance class time with study plus sports or a part-time job or all of those things. Let's say you're a housewife entering the job market for the first time. You could say how you had to manage all the different schedules in the family, the children's schedule, the husband's schedule, all these different schedules. And then you simply make a connection between what you've done in the past to that current job opening. You want to convince the interviewer that you can handle the time requirements of the job. That's the bottom line. So again, when you're asked questions about how you manage time or how do you set realistic deadlines, remember that the employer just wants to know if you're well organized and you manage your time well. So what the employer wants to know is, how well do you manage your time? Can you make realistic deadlines? And does your time management system actually work to achieve success? So be sure to tell them what your system is, whatever it is, and then be sure to give them a concrete example of how that's worked for you in the past and how it will apply to this business in the future. When it comes to handling tough interview questions, there's 3 things you always want to keep in mind. Number 1, be brief. Number 2, always be positive. Number 3, describe how you'll bring value to that business. So no matter what the tough question is, keep your answer brief and to the point. If they want to know more, they'll ask you more. Number 2, always be positive. Nothing can kill your chances faster than coming across as negative. Then number 3, always describe how you're going to bring value to that company. Remember, what employers want to know most is what you can do for them. So no matter what the question is, make sure that you demonstrate value. You describe how you'll bring benefit to that company. Will you help them save money? Will you help them make more money? Will you be helping with an important project or goal? Always talk about the value you'll bring to that company. So remember, be brief, be positive, and describe the value you will bring to that company. Now you know how to handle the toughest job interview questions you'll ever get. Remember, I suggest that instead of just listening to this program, that you actually sit down and write down answers yourself. After you write them down, read them. Do they make sense? If they don't, rewrite them until they do. And then, just for fun, why don't you have a friend or a relative ask you questions, and then you answer them just like you're in a real interview. Now remember, the goal of all of that, writing them down or having a friend pretend that they're interviewing you, is not so that you are scripted. It's not so that you memorize answers. Your goal here is not to come across like an actor who's just playing a role. The goal here is to be comfortable with answering questions, to be familiar with how to answer questions properly, even if they're tough questions. I wish you the best of success in your job search. This is David Portney saying goodbye for now and live with confidence.